The rain hit the courthouse windows like tiny bullets the morning Ethan Walker returned home officially for the first time in 8 years. The city he once loved looked colder now, sharper somehow, as if every building had forgotten his name the same way his family had. Inside Courtroom 7, whispers floated through the crowded gallery. Reporters sat near the back, curious about the wealthy Walker family inheritance dispute that had suddenly become headline news. Ethan adjusted the sleeves of his dark suit and ignored the stares burning into him. His hands were steady, but his chest felt heavy enough to crack his ribs. At the front of the courtroom sat his father, Richard Walker, billionaire owner of Walker Defense Technologies. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his expensive watch gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. To strangers, Richard looked powerful and composed. To Ethan, he looked exactly the same as the man who once forgot his 17th birthday because a golf partner canceled dinner plans. Ethan's younger sister, Olivia, avoided looking at him entirely. His brother Mason stared with open disgust. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Walker, this hearing concerns your claim that the individual before this court is fraudulently impersonating your deceased son. Is that correct?" Richard stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." The words sliced through Ethan harder than he expected. Dead. His own father had legally declared him dead 2 years earlier. Not missing, not unreachable, dead. Ethan swallowed quietly as Richard continued, speaking with smooth confidence. "My son served overseas years ago. We were informed there was an incident connected to classified operations. After extensive waiting and investigation, we accepted the heartbreaking reality of his death." The courtroom listened carefully. Richard turned toward Ethan with cold eyes. "This man appeared only after my company holdings and estate restructuring became public. He has no verifiable military records available to this court and no legitimate proof beyond forged documents." Ethan felt every pair of eyes move toward him. Impostor, con artist, fraud. The accusations filled the room without anyone saying them aloud. His attorney rose quickly. "Your Honor, my client possesses identification, biometric records, and—" Richard interrupted smoothly. "Documents can be fabricated." The judge lifted a hand. Mr. Walker let counsel finish, but the damage was already done. Ethan looked toward the gallery and saw people whispering behind their hands. Some reporters were already typing. His own father had spent months preparing this. Years, maybe. The realization settled painfully into Ethan's chest. This wasn't fear. This was strategy. Richard Walker was trying to erase his son publicly before Ethan could reclaim his legal rights to the family estate. The judge turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Ethan Walker, would you like to address the court personally?" For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. He remembered being 10 years old, standing outside in the rain after baseball practice, while every other parent picked up their child. Richard arrived 2 hours late and never apologized. He remembered graduating military academy with honors while his father sent only a text message that read, "Proud of the family name." "Not proud of you, never him." Ethan stood slowly. "My records are sealed because the work I performed required security clearance beyond public access." Richard laughed softly from across the room. Convenient. A few people in the gallery chuckled nervously. The judge frowned. "Do you have any witness or official verification supporting your claims?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't supposed to discuss the details of his assignment. Even now, parts of his service remained classified under federal protection. For years he had sacrificed birthdays, relationships, and safety for missions he could never speak about. And now the silence protecting his country was helping his father destroy him. Richard stepped forward dramatically. "Your Honor, this charade has deeply wounded our grieving family. My real son died serving this nation, and this man is exploiting that tragedy for money." Olivia lowered her head as if emotional. Mason nodded beside her. The performance was flawless. Ethan felt something inside him break, not because strangers doubted him. Because his family rehearsed this together. The judge exhaled carefully. Given the lack of publicly verifiable military documentation this court may need to, the courtroom doors suddenly opened. Every head turned. 2 uniformed military officers entered silently. One carried a sealed dark envelope marked with the official seal of the Department of Defense. The older officer walked directly toward the judge. "Apologies for the interruption, Your Honor," he said firmly. Then he glanced toward Ethan. "We're here regarding Sergeant Ethan Walker." The courtroom became so quiet that even the rain outside seemed to stop. Every eye followed the military officer as he approached the judge's bench, carrying the sealed envelope. The sharp sound of his polished shoes against the marble floor echoed through the room like a countdown. Richard Walker's confidence finally cracked just slightly, but Ethan saw it. The officer handed the envelope to the judge carefully. This document was authorized directly by the Department of Defense and the Pentagon Legal Affairs Office for immediate review. The judge examined the official seal. Her expression changed instantly. She looked toward Ethan again, but this time there was caution in her eyes instead of doubt. "Permission to open," she asked formally. The officer nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." The seal broke with a crisp tear that somehow sounded louder than Richard's entire speech earlier. The judge unfolded several pages. As she read, the color slowly drained from Richard Walker's face. The courtroom waited in complete silence. Finally, the judge looked up. "For the record," she said carefully, "these documents confirm that Ethan Alexander Walker is not only the legitimate son of Richard Walker, but also an active former operative attached to multiple classified defense operations under federal authorization." A shocked murmur exploded across the gallery. Reporters immediately grabbed their phones. Olivia's eyes widened in panic. Mason looked like someone had punched the air from his lungs. Richard remained frozen. The judge continued reading. "Due to the classified nature of Sergeant Walker's assignments, portions of his service history were intentionally restricted from public databases under national security protocols." She lowered the papers slowly. "This court recognizes Mr. Ethan Walker as legally and unquestionably authentic." The words hit the room like thunder. Richard's attorney stood abruptly. "Your Honor, perhaps there has been some misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding," the judge interrupted sharply. The older military officer finally turned toward Richard. "With respect, sir, your son spent years risking his life for this country, while his identity remained protected under orders. Your legal team clearly failed to investigate honestly." The humiliation on Richard's face was almost unbearable to watch. For the first time in Ethan's life, his father looked small. One reporter near the back whispered loudly, "This is going everywhere," and Ethan realized it was true. By nightfall, every business partner, investor, and social contact Richard Walker valued would know exactly what happened in this courtroom. His father had called an American serviceman a fraud in public. His own son. The judge removed her glasses. "Mr. Walker," she said coldly toward Richard, "this court takes false testimony and deliberate misrepresentation extremely seriously." Richard straightened his jacket, trying desperately to recover control. "My intentions were only to protect my family and company from confusion." "No," Ethan said quietly. The room turned toward him. It was the first time he had interrupted his father in years. Ethan stepped forward slowly. "You are protecting the inheritance." Richard's jaw tightened. Ethan looked directly into his father's eyes, refusing to back down now. "You declared me dead 2 years after I stopped answering calls from overseas." His voice remained calm, but every word carried years of pain. "You didn't search for me. You didn't wait for confirmation. You erased me." Richard's face hardened again. "You disappeared without explanation. I was deployed. You abandoned this family." The accusation landed hard. Not because it was true, because Ethan had spent years secretly fearing it might be. The military officer beside the judge spoke firmly. "Sergeant Walker volunteered for assignments most people in this courtroom could not survive." Silence returned instantly. Ethan looked down briefly. Memories flashed through his mind: desert heat, sleepless nights, coded transmissions, funerals for soldiers whose families never learned the full truth. And through all of it, he had still believed home would remain home. What hurt most wasn't the inheritance fight. It was realizing his father had found it easier to bury him than believe in him. Olivia suddenly stood from her seat. "Dad, maybe we should leave." Richard ignored her. Instead, He stared at Ethan with quiet anger and something deeper beneath it. Fear, not fear of losing money, fear of losing control. The judge cleared her throat. This hearing is suspended pending investigation into the estate filings and prior sworn statements. The gavel struck loudly, but nobody moved, because the entire courtroom understood something had changed forever. Then the older officer stepped beside Ethan and handed him a small folded paper. "What's this?" Ethan asked quietly. The officer gave a faint smile, a message from someone very high up in Washington. Ethan unfolded the note carefully. Only one sentence was written inside. "You were never forgotten." By sunrise the next morning, every major business website and news station carried the same headline: "Billionaire accused of declaring decorated son dead for financial gain." Richard Walker spent years building a reputation as a disciplined patriot who respected military service. In less than 12 hours, that image began collapsing like glass under a hammer, but Ethan never gave a single interview. That confused everyone the most. Reporters waited outside his temporary hotel. News channels invited him to speak publicly. Social media praised him as a forgotten hero betrayed by his own family. Still, Ethan stayed silent. Because revenge no longer felt like screaming. It felt like truth. 3 days later, Ethan entered Walker Defense Technologies headquarters for the first time in nearly a decade. Employees froze when they saw him crossing the marble lobby. Some recognized him immediately, others whispered. The same security guard who once watched Ethan get thrown out by Richard years earlier now nervously opened the executive elevator for him without a word. The top floor looked exactly the same: expensive artwork, polished glass walls, artificial smiles. Only now, fear floated through every hallway. Richard stood inside the boardroom waiting with company attorneys and executives. His face looked older than it had in court. "You shouldn't be here," Richard said coldly. Ethan placed a thin folder on the conference table. "Actually," he replied calmly, "half this company legally belongs to me until the estate investigation finishes." Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Richard's voice sharpened. "What do you want?" That question lingered heavily in the room. What did Ethan want? An apology, justice, to watch his father lose everything. For years during lonely deployments, Ethan imagined returning home angry enough to destroy Richard completely. But standing there now, he realized something painful. His father had already destroyed himself. Ethan opened the folder slowly. Inside were copied financial records, transaction histories, and overseas account documents. The company lawyer immediately paled. Richard noticed, and for the first time genuine panic flashed across his face. "Where did you get those?" he demanded. Ethan ignored the question. "I spent years working intelligence support operations," he said quietly. "You'd be surprised what skills that teaches someone." One executive leaned forward nervously. "Mr. Walker, are these real?" Ethan slid another paper across the table. Signed authorizations, forged signatures, hidden transfers. Millions quietly moved through shell companies over several years. The room fell silent except for the low hum of air conditioning. Richard suddenly slammed his hand against the table. "You ungrateful little bastard." Nobody reacted, not even Ethan, because hearing insults from his father no longer hurt the way it once had. That terrified Richard more than anything. "You taught me something important growing up," Ethan said calmly. Richard laughed bitterly. "And what's that?" "That power matters more to you than family." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. One older board member removed his glasses slowly. "Richard, if these documents become public, federal investigators will tear this company apart." "They won't," Richard snapped. Ethan finally looked around the room. "They already have." Several people stared at him in shock. Ethan nodded toward the windows overlooking the parking lot below. 2 black government vehicles had just entered the property gates. Richard rushed toward the glass. For the first time in his powerful, controlled life, Ethan saw his father completely helpless, and strangely, Ethan felt no satisfaction. Only sadness, because little boys never truly stop wanting their fathers to love them, even after betrayal, even after humiliation, even after being declared dead. Mason suddenly entered the boardroom breathlessly. "Dad, reporters are everywhere downstairs. Richard turned furiously toward Ethan. You planned this? No, Ethan answered quietly. You planned this the day you erased me. Silence swallowed the room. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and placed a second folder onto the table. These are employee pension records, he said. The executives looked confused. You stole retirement funds to cover hidden losses, Ethan continued. But I already restored the accounts yesterday using my inheritance freeze order. Several board members looked stunned. You repaid the employees. One whispered. Ethan nodded. The older board member stared at him carefully before speaking. After everything your family did to you, why help this company at all? Ethan glanced toward his father one final time. Because innocent people worked here. Richard lowered himself slowly into a chair, looking suddenly exhausted. The mighty Richard Walker, feared by executives, admired by politicians, now sat alone while his own son protected the workers he exploited. And in that moment, Ethan understood the sweetest revenge wasn't destroying his father's empire. It was becoming the kind of man Richard Walker could never be. 6 months later, the Walker mansion no longer looked powerful. The fountains were dry. The front gates stayed open because half the security staff had been dismissed. Expensive cars no longer lined the circular driveway, and the giant windows that once glowed with luxury now reflected only emptiness. Ethan stood outside the estate just before sunset, staring at the home that had shaped so much of his pain. For years, he imagined returning there victorious, but victory felt quieter than he expected. A housekeeper opened the door softly and gave him a sympathetic nod. He's in the study. Ethan walked slowly through the mansion halls. Every step carried old memories with it. Childhood piano lessons his father never attended, lonely dinners eaten beside empty chairs, awards displayed proudly for visitors but never discussed. Privately at home, the house had always been beautiful. It had never truly been warm. When Ethan entered the study, Richard Walker sat alone beside the fireplace wearing a dark sweater instead of his usual expensive suits. Legal investigations had shattered his business empire piece by piece. Investors abandoned him, friends disappeared. Even Mason had moved overseas to avoid public attention. Only Olivia still visited occasionally. Richard looked older now. Not physically, spiritually. The proud businessman who once controlled every room now seemed like a man trapped inside the ruins of his own choices. You came, Richard said quietly. Ethan remained near the doorway. You asked. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The silence between them carried decades inside it. Finally, Richard poured 2 glasses of water with slightly shaking hands. I don't suppose you'd stay long enough for dinner. Ethan almost smiled sadly. His father had ignored thousands of chances to share meals together. Now he was offering one when everything else was gone. No, Ethan answered gently. Richard nodded as if he expected it. The fire crackled softly nearby. I read about the Scholarship Foundation, Richard said after a moment. Ethan had used part of the restored inheritance money to create scholarships for military families, especially children whose parents were deployed overseas. Another portion funded housing support for abandoned teenagers. The programs grew faster than anyone expected. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt proud of what his family name represented. It's doing well, he replied quietly. Richard stared into the fireplace. Your mother would have loved that. The mention of her still hurt. She had died years earlier believing the tension between father and son would eventually heal. Neither of them had realized how deep the damage truly went. Richard cleared his throat slowly. I owe you an apology. Ethan stayed silent. I spent your whole life trying to make you harder, Richard admitted. I thought kindness created weakness. His voice sounded tired now, stripped of arrogance, but you became stronger than me anyway. Ethan looked at him carefully. Those words were probably the most honest thing his father had ever said. Richard swallowed painfully. When you disappeared into those classified assignments, I told myself you chose strangers over family. He laughed bitterly. Truth was I hated that you became a man people respected without money. The confession settled heavily in the room. All those years, all that cruelty, and underneath it had been jealousy. A father jealous of his own son. Richard looked up slowly. eyes wet for the first time Ethan had ever seen. "I was afraid of you," he whispered. Ethan felt anger flicker briefly inside him, but it faded almost immediately, because the broken man sitting before him no longer controlled his life. "I used to spend years wanting you to love me," Ethan admitted quietly. Richard lowered his eyes. "But I don't need that anymore." The words were not cruel. That made them hurt even more. Ethan stepped toward the doorway again. "I didn't come here for revenge." "Then why did you come?" Ethan paused. "To say goodbye." Richard closed his eyes slowly, as though the words physically wounded him. Ethan walked out of the study and through the silent mansion one final time. Outside, the evening air felt lighter than it had in years. As he reached the front gate, his phone buzzed with a message from one of the scholarship students thanking him for changing her life. Ethan smiled softly toward the darkening sky. In the end, the greatest revenge was never making his father suffer. It was building a life so meaningful that the betrayal no longer mattered.